pilot refused to board black passengers but then found out who owned the airline. The terminal buzzed with the rhythm of travelers dragging suitcases across polished floors, announcements echoing from overhead speakers, and the low murmur of conversations blending into one steady hum. Through the tide of hurried footsteps and impatient sighs, he moved with unshakable calm. Dressed in a sharp suit that caught the light with each step, the black passenger carried himself with quiet authority. His shoes were polished, his tie perfectly knotted, his leather briefcase swinging lightly at his side. Nothing about him suggested rush or disorder. Every gesture was deliberate, every step confident, as though the chaos of the airport could not touch him. When he reached the gate, he offered a warm smile to the attendant. His ticket rested neatly in his hand, ready without fumbling. He spoke politely, his voice low but firm, asking only what was necessary. The attendant glanced at the ticket, scanned it, and nodded with professional ease. For a moment he seemed like any other passenger about to board, a man who belonged exactly where he stood. But just behind the counter, the pilot emerged. His uniform was pressed, his cap tilted with practiced precision, his pale face set in the smug authority of someone accustomed to obedience. His eyes swept the line of waiting passengers and then landed on the man in the suit. For a fraction of a second, his expression froze. His jaw tightened, his brow furrowed. The confidence in his stride faltered, replaced by a frown that lingered far too long. It was not a look of curiosity, but of disdain. The corners of his mouth twisted downward, and his eyes narrowed as if the sight alone offended him. He glanced quickly at the attendant, then back at the passenger, his gaze filled with an unspoken judgment. The contrast between the man's calm composure and the pilot's sneer was stark, visible even to those nearby. Some shifted awkwardly, sensing the tension, while others pretended not to notice, eyes glued to their phones. The black passenger remained still, his posture unchanged. He adjusted his cuff slightly, met the pilot's stare for only a brief moment, then turned his attention back to the boarding gate as though the frown had no power. His silence was not submission but restraint, a calmness that radiated strength. He did not need to answer the pilot's disdain. His presence alone was answer enough. The pilot, however, lingered by the counter, arms folded, his eyes never leaving the passenger. His stance carried the weight of arrogance, as though he were preparing himself for something more than a flight. The air between them thickened with tension, but the suited man remained steady, his ticket still in hand, his dignity untouched. He had no need to rush, no need to prove anything. The gate would open, the flight would depart, and he would board with the same quiet confidence he had carried all along. What no one in that moment realized was that the encounter at the gate was only the first tremor in a story that would shake the entire terminal. The frown of disdain would soon crumble, and the calm composure of the man in the suit would reveal a truth that left every whisper in the airport transformed into awe. The murmur of the boarding line quieted as the pilot stepped forward, his presence commanding attention for all the wrong reasons. He positioned himself firmly in front of the suited passenger, his jaw set, his posture radiating hostility. The attendant froze behind the counter, uncertain whether to intervene, but the pilot's voice rose above the bustle of the terminal before anyone else could act. "This seat is not meant for people like you," he declared, each word enunciated loudly enough for every passenger nearby to hear. His tone carried arrogance, as though he were not only a pilot but also a gatekeeper to something sacred. Heads turned instantly. Those in line paused mid-step, and conversations hushed into silence. The black passenger stood still, his ticket held calmly in his hand. He did not flinch, did not raise his voice, but the sting of the words reverberated through the gate area. The phrase hung in the air like a bruise. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the two men, while others looked away, pretending to study their phones as if ignoring the scene could absolve them of its discomfort. The pilot doubled down, repeating his refusal more forcefully. "You will not board this plane." He gestured broadly, his voice laced with cruelty. "I don't care what your ticket says. This is not your place." The disdain in his tone carried further than the flashing monitors or the intercom announcements. It cut across the crowd with deliberate sharpness. A mother holding her child gasped softly, turning her body as though to shield her little one from the ugliness of the moment. A man near the back of the line raised his phone discreetly, capturing the exchange. The attendants exchanged uneasy glances, their faces strained between duty to their superior and the obvious wrong unfolding in front of them. Still, the passenger in the sharp suit remained unshaken. His shoulders did not slump, his hands did not tremble. He looked at the pilot with steady eyes, silent but resolute, his composure making the pilot's aggression seem even more unprofessional. He had endured such looks before, such dismissals, but never on a stage so public, never with so many eyes bearing witness. The pilot sneered, his lips curling with disdain, as though expecting submission, as though waiting for the man to shrink or retreat. But the passenger did not step back. He adjusted his cuff, an almost imperceptible movement, and stood even taller, the ticket still poised in his hand as a quiet reminder that he had every right to board. The cruelty of the dismissal settled into the air, pressing down on everyone present. Some passengers shook their heads, whispering that it was wrong, while others stayed silent out of fear of being pulled into the confrontation. The humiliation was intended to strip the man of dignity, to brand him as an outsider unworthy of entry. Yet his silence, his unwavering presence, only underscored the imbalance of the moment. The gate, once filled with the ordinary impatience of travel, now became the stage for a clash that would not be forgotten. The arrogance of the pilot had turned a routine boarding into a spectacle of injustice, and though he believed himself in control, the very cruelty he unleashed was already beginning to unravel his authority. The tension at the gate thickened until it seemed to fill the air like smoke. The pilot's voice rose louder, his words dripping with disdain, while the man in the tailored suit stood quietly, ticket still held in his hand. Around them, passengers shifted uneasily. Some averted their eyes, staring down at their phones or at the carpet beneath their feet, ashamed of what they were witnessing, yet unwilling to intervene. Others could not look away, their faces tight with discomfort, silently questioning how such cruelty could unfold in plain view. A few pulled out their phones, holding them carefully at chest level to record the exchange. The faint glow of screens reflected off their glasses, capturing the humiliation as it played out. The scene had become more than a dispute about boarding a plane. It had become a performance, one forced upon the black passenger, turned into a public spectacle without his consent. The pilot sneered, as if aware of the attention, his arrogance swelling under the weight of an audience. He made comments not about safety or policy, but about worth, his tone dripping with mockery. Each word was calculated to demean, to remind the man in the suit of what the pilot believed to be his place. Yet through it all, the passenger remained calm. His shoulders did not bend, his voice did not rise, his face showed neither anger nor shame. He stood tall, dignity wrapped around him like a shield, absorbing the humiliation without letting it break him. The silence of those who looked away, and the whispers of those who recorded became part of the scene. Parents hushed their children, couples exchanged uneasy glances, a group of business travelers muttered under their breath, but did nothing more. The weight of complicity hung heavy, making the cruelty of the moment even sharper. The pilot thrived on the imbalance, his smirk widening each time no one stepped forward. But even as the insult echoed through the gate area, the calm composure of the passenger spoke louder than the pilot's sneer. His silence was not weakness, but defiance. By refusing to be rattled, he revealed the emptiness of the attack. Those who recorded sensed it, capturing not just the aggression, but also the strength in his stillness. The crowd did not yet know who he was, but they could feel it that something about him was unshakable. While the pilot tried to turn the boarding gate into a stage of humiliation, the passenger's unbroken presence was transforming it into a stage of quiet power. In the eyes of those who dared to watch closely, the balance had already begun to shift, though the pilot was too blinded by his arrogance to see it. The pilot's voice still carried through the gate area, but the passenger did not respond with raised tone or frantic protest. He shifted slightly, lifting his chin so that his eyes met the pilot's squarely. The quiet in his expression was almost disarming, a contrast so sharp that the crowd seemed to lean forward without realizing it. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and deliberate, spoken with a calm that settled over the noise like a heavy curtain. "Are you absolutely certain about your decision?" he asked, his voice steady, his diction clear. It was not a plea, and it was not a challenge barked in anger. It was something far heavier, a question meant to linger, meant to press down on the arrogance of the man standing in front of him. The crowd felt the shift immediately. The balance of the encounter tilted, even if only slightly, and the air grew charged. The passengers holding phones raised them higher, eager not to miss a word. A silence hung between the two men, stretching long enough for the meaning of the question to land. The pilot blinked, momentarily unsettled, before his lips curled back into a scoff. He laughed under his breath, then louder, waving his hand dismissively as though swatting away an insect. "Yes," he replied, almost shouting, puffing his chest as though the calmness of the question had struck a nerve. "I am certain. You are not boarding this plane. Do you understand me?" His words rang with cruelty, his voice echoing through the gate area with enough volume to draw more attention. People from neighboring gates began turning their heads, curious to see what had sparked such drama. But the man in the suit did not flinch. His shoulders remained squared, his eyes unwavering, his calm intact. The contrast was striking. Where the pilot relied on volume and bluster, the passenger relied on restraint. He adjusted his tie with the same composure he had carried since stepping into the terminal, then let the silence stretch again. His presence alone was enough to make the pilot's arrogance appear desperate. The scoff turned into more insults. The pilot muttered about rules, about authority, his words a crumbling wall of excuses rather than legitimate reasons. He spoke louder with every sentence, convinced that if he shouted enough, his authority would remain unquestioned. But the calm warning had already planted doubt in the minds of the onlookers. They began whispering to one another, wondering who this man truly was. He did not act like someone powerless, and his question carried weight, as though he already knew the outcome of the story. The crowd felt it before the pilot did. His control of the situation was slipping, and the man in the suit had not raised his voice once. The warning had been delivered, and though the pilot scoffed and doubled down, the certainty in his words sounded thinner than before. The arrogance that once seemed unshakable was already beginning to crack. The smirk still lingered on the pilot's face. His arms crossed as if no amount of calm defiance could break through his authority. Around them, the gate had grown silent. The passengers caught between discomfort and fascination, their phones raised higher to capture every detail. The man in the sharp suit stood still, his ticket still in his hand, and then, without a word, he reached into his jacket pocket. His movements were steady, deliberate, without haste or hesitation. He drew out his phone, its screen casting a faint glow across his composed features. The crowd leaned forward instinctively, waiting to see whom he would call. Some expected him to dial a lawyer, others a friend, but when he scrolled to the top of his contacts and pressed a number, the quiet power of the act was unmistakable. His posture never faltered. The phone lifted to his ear, and his voice emerged low but firm, each syllable precise. "This is me," he said, speaking as if the person on the other end required no introduction. His words were brief, professional, carrying weight far beyond their simplicity. He named the gate, the flight, and the situation with the clarity of someone who had handled crises far greater than this. There was no trace of desperation, no raised tone of anger. His voice was calm, but it carried a gravity that sent ripples through those close enough to hear. The effect on the crowd was immediate. Whispers spread like fire, passengers nudging one another, eyes widening as they tried to piece together who he might be speaking to. His manner did not belong to an ordinary traveler begging for help. It belonged to someone who knew exactly how to command attention without raising his voice. Some of the onlookers who had been recording lowered their phones slightly, as if realizing they were capturing something historic rather than a mere confrontation. The pilot chuckled under his breath, scoffing at the sight of the phone call. "Call whoever you want," he muttered loudly enough for the passengers to hear. His smirk widened, convinced the act was meaningless. To him, the gesture was an empty performance, another chance to display his dominance in front of an audience. His eyes flicked toward the crowd, as though expecting them to share in the humor of the moment. But the crowd did not laugh. They watched the suited man's face as he listened for a reply, nodding once before speaking again. His words were few, delivered with quiet authority, but they carried the unmistakable cadence of power. He did not plead for assistance. He issued instructions. When he ended the call, sliding the phone back into his pocket, his calm expression had not shifted. He looked at the pilot with the same steady gaze, saying nothing more, letting the silence carry the weight of what had just passed between them. The pilot shook his head, dismissing the act with another scoff, but the murmurs in the crowd betrayed the shift. They sensed something significant had taken place, something the pilot had not yet grasped. The air at the gate felt charged now, filled with anticipation. The man in the suit had whispered power into the phone, and everyone knew it would not be long before its echo returned to reshape the entire scene. The minutes ticked by with a tension that made every second feel heavier than the last. The crowd remained hushed, eyes darting between the suited passenger who stood with his quiet dignity intact and the pilot whose arrogance still clung to him like a uniform. Then, the sound of hurried footsteps cut through the silence. From the end of the terminal, a group of airline officials appeared, moving quickly, their expressions tight with urgency. Their suits and badges marked them as high-ranking, their very presence carrying an authority that even the pilot could not ignore. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The officials did not glance at the pilot first, nor did they survey the crowd. Their eyes locked on the black passenger, and in unison their postures softened with respect. As they reached him, they greeted him by name, their voices carrying the deference reserved for someone far beyond an ordinary traveler. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, who had been holding their breath since the confrontation began. Phones trembled in hands as people leaned closer, whispering to one another with disbelief. The suited man inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, his composure unchanged, as though he had expected this moment all along. He did not gloat, did not raise his voice to point out the irony. His silence was enough. The weight of recognition was already crashing over the pilot. His smirk dissolved, his jaw tightening as realization began to dawn. The man he had tried to humiliate, the passenger he had dismissed so arrogantly, was not only someone of importance, but someone the airline itself treated with reverence. The officials positioned themselves around the passenger as though shielding him from further insult. Their words to him were quiet, professional, tinged with apology. Then, finally, one of them turned toward the pilot. The authority in his voice was immediate, sharp, leaving no room for argument. The crowd did not hear every word, but they saw the effect. The pilot's face drained of color, his body stiffened, and he stumbled over hurried explanations. He gestured vaguely, trying to cling to the illusion of authority, but the officials did not indulge him. The onlookers erupted into murmurs that swept across the gate like a wave. People whispered that this was no ordinary passenger, that something extraordinary was unfolding before their eyes. Those with phones recording zoomed in, eager to capture every reaction, every flicker of shame crossing the pilot's face, every respectful word directed toward the man in the suit. What had begun as a humiliating dismissal had turned into revelation. The suited passenger's identity was no longer a mystery to those who paid attention. The officials had confirmed it without announcing it outright, their behavior telling the story more clearly than words could. This was a man who commanded respect at the highest levels of the airline, someone whose presence transformed the balance of power in a single moment. The crowd leaned in, their whispers building into awe. The legend was already forming in real time. The man who had been denied boarding was now revealed as someone who did not merely board planes, he owned the skies above them. The gate area, once filled with ordinary impatience, was now a theater of revelation. The suited passenger stood calm at the center, while the officials who had rushed to the scene positioned themselves around him with deference that could not be mistaken. Their words carried clearly enough for the nearest rows of travelers to hear. They addressed him by his full name, and then, with careful precision, acknowledged his role not simply as a valued client, but as the owner of the airline itself. Gasps broke out immediately. The whispers that had been simmering for minutes ignited into a storm of voices. People leaned into one another, repeating the words in disbelief. "The owner," they said, "he owns the airline." Phones that had been raised to capture humiliation now caught history being written. Every angle recorded the collapse of the pilot's confidence, the way his body stiffened, his face drained of color, his authority dissolving in the air. The pilot's smirk was gone. His lips trembled as though searching for an explanation, his eyes darting between the officials and the man he had tried to shame. He stuttered, reaching for excuses about protocol, about misunderstanding, but the words fell flat. No explanation could cover the weight of what had just been revealed. The very company whose uniform he wore belonged to the man he had denied, and the authority he flaunted had never truly been his. The crowd could feel it. The shift was undeniable, the imbalance corrected in an instant. Where moments earlier the pilot's arrogance filled the space, now the calm dignity of the owner filled it instead. The silence of the passenger had always carried weight, but now that weight had a name and power behind it that no sneer could undo. The officials did not hide their displeasure. One of them addressed the pilot firmly, his words sharp and unyielding. Though the exact phrasing could not be heard by all, the tone alone revealed that consequences would follow. The pilot tried again to speak, but the officials cut him off, their attention returning immediately to the man in the suit, their true priority. The whispers grew into something louder. passengers murmuring with awe as if they had just witnessed a parable unfold before their eyes. The story was already spreading in real time, carried from phone to phone, from whisper to whisper. What had begun as humiliation was now transformed into legend, the kind of tale retold in countless variations, each one carrying the same moral arrogance collapses in the face of quiet power. The black passenger, still holding his ticket, did not gloat, did not even smile. He straightened his posture, nodded slightly at the officials, and allowed the silence of his presence to speak louder than any boast. The truth had been revealed, and it was enough. The terminal was still buzzing with whispers when the suited man turned at last to the pilot. His voice was calm, carrying no anger, no need to raise itself above the noise. Yet every syllable cut sharper than any shout could have. He said the words simply, almost gently, but they landed with the weight of final judgment. His services were no longer required. The crowd froze, their murmurs silenced in an instant. The pilot's lips parted as if to object, but no sound came. The authority he had flaunted so confidently only minutes before had been stripped away, leaving him bare before the very audience that had once been his stage. He tried to meet the owner's eyes but could not hold the gaze. Instead, his head dropped slightly, his confidence leaking away like air from a punctured tire. The officials stepped forward, their faces stern, their movements swift and decisive. They flanked the pilot without hesitation, their hands guiding him away from the gate. He did not resist. His arrogance had collapsed into silence, his body hunched as though weighed down by the enormity of his downfall. Each step he took toward the exit echoed through the terminal, heavy with the memory of his earlier sneers. The passengers who had witnessed the entire spectacle broke into hushed commentary. Phones followed the retreating figure, recording the sight of the once proud pilot being escorted away by his own company. A few gasps gave way to murmurs of satisfaction, voices rising with the thrill of justice served in real time. What had begun as humiliation for one man had ended in humiliation for another, the balance corrected in front of all. The suited owner did not gloat, did not move beyond a quiet nod as the scene played out. His calm was steady, his dignity shining brighter than any announcement over the loudspeakers. He adjusted his cuff, glanced briefly at the crowd, and then turned back toward the officials who now waited attentively for his direction. His composure said everything. He had not needed to shout. He had not needed to match cruelty with cruelty. His authority had been revealed in the simplest way possible, by removing a man unfit to hold power. As the pilot disappeared into the distance, whispers carried like ripples through the terminal. People repeated the words they had heard, the revelation of ownership, the calm dismissal that had turned the gate into a courtroom of sorts. Strangers exchanged glances filled with awe. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others smiled faintly, as though grateful to have seen justice unfold with such clarity. The legend of the moment was already taking shape. The man who had been denied boarding was not only allowed to step onto the plane, but he had also decided the fate of the one who tried to bar him. And though the story would soon spread beyond the walls of that terminal, for those who were there, the memory was etched permanently. The pilot's bowed head, the steady voice of the owner, and the undeniable truth that dignity had triumphed over arrogance would be retold again and again as proof that power revealed itself not in cruelty, but in composure. The moment the pilot disappeared down the terminal, escorted with his head lowered, the gate area released a collective breath. The suited man, still poised with the calm authority he had carried throughout, did not revel in the downfall. Instead, he stepped toward the jet bridge with measured strides. His ticket, once questioned, was now irrelevant. Every person in the terminal knew who he was. The attendants bowed their heads slightly as he passed, their gestures filled with respect. As he entered the plane, the passengers who had been waiting already knew what had happened outside. Word had spread faster than boarding announcements. Phones buzzed, whispers raced through the cabin, and when he appeared at the doorway, people straightened in their seats. Some clapped hesitantly at first, the sound soft but clear. Then the applause grew, filling the cabin with a rhythm that echoed louder than any insult hurled at him earlier. He walked down the aisle with dignity, acknowledging the gestures with a quiet nod, his composure unbroken. The seat reserved for him was not just any seat. It was at the front, a place of prominence, but it felt now like a throne. When he sat, it was not with arrogance, but with the grace of someone who had endured humiliation and responded with strength. The applause faded into a respectful hush, the cabin filled with an energy that was almost reverent. People leaned toward one another, whispering the story, retelling every detail they had witnessed at the gate. Some showed videos already uploaded to their phones, the glowing screens capturing the confrontation, the phone call, the arrival of officials, and the quiet dismissal of the pilot. Outside the cabin, in the terminal, the story spread like wildfire. Strangers who had only glimpsed the scene repeated it in fragments, passing it along as if it were too remarkable to keep to themselves. Airport staff carried the tale between counters, security personnel whispered it into radios, and passengers waiting at other gates leaned in to hear the version told by those who had been close enough to watch. The story grew with every telling, but at its center remained one truth: dignity had triumphed over arrogance. The legend was not only that the man owned the airline, though that revelation had shocked them all, it was that he had revealed it with such restraint, never raising his voice, never losing his composure, even when he was mocked and refused entry. His strength lay not just in his position, but in the way he chose to handle cruelty. That was what people would remember most, what would be repeated long after the flight had departed. As the plane prepared for takeoff, he gazed out the window, the city lights shimmering below. To the passengers around him, he was no longer just a man in a suit. He had become a symbol, proof that true power does not shout, but stands quietly, unshaken, until the moment it reveals itself. The legend had already taken flight, whispered across the airport, and it would continue to soar far beyond those walls, carried as a story of reversal, justice, and unshakable grace.